The heat of the Pacific was relentless. Beneath the scorching sun, vast stretches of ocean glistened with nothing but an expanse of blue as far as the eye could see. In the early summer of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had reached its breaking point. The once proud fleet that had struck fear into the hearts of nations was now faltering. The Marianas were in the crosshairs of America's overwhelming military machine. It was a moment in history that would come to symbolize the bitter transition of power in the skies above the Pacific, when Japanese pilots, once the terror of the skies, began to realize they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. For years, the Japanese pilots had flown with an unwavering belief in their superiority. They were trained to be precise, deadly, and relentless. Their Zeros were quick and agile, and their pilots were some of the finest to ever take to the sky. But as the tide of war shifted, so too did the nature of air combat. The Americans had adapted quickly. They had learned from their mistakes, and now, with the introduction of the F-6F Hellcat, the situation had changed. One pilot who would soon learn just how much had changed was Lieutenant Taro Miyamoto, a veteran of the Imperial Navy. He had seen his fair share of dogfights over the Pacific, each one a brutal reminder of the stakes. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited above the skies of the Marianas in the summer of 1944. The day was like any other when Miyamoto climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0. His hands, calloused from years of flying, gripped the controls as the roar of the engine filled the air around him. As he taxied across the runway on the island of Saipan, the familiar sight of his comrades in formation gave him a sense of reassurance. This was their ground, their fight. They had flown these skies for years, dominating the skies over the Pacific with pride. But the storm that was brewing on Saipan felt different. The Americans had launched their assault on the Marianas just days before. Miyamoto's squadron had been tasked with intercepting any Allied aircraft attempting to protect the fleet. But as he soared into the sky, the heavy weight of the heat pressing down on his chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Far below, the American ships were advancing relentlessly toward the islands. Their warships were relentless, steamrolling their way across the Pacific with a level of determination that Miyamoto felt uneasy. The weight of the Allies' numbers seemed to press down on him. But what would come next would be far more terrifying than anything he had expected. It didn't take long before Miyamoto and his comrades encountered the first wave of American aircraft. Their silhouettes appeared in the distance, almost too far to make out. But it was their numbers that hit him first. There was no single Hellcat, no lone fighter. There were hundreds. A formation of American fighters, the Hellcats, spread out like a carpet across the sky. It was as if the entire expanse of America's military might had taken to the air. The Hellcat was different from anything he had fought before. It wasn't as nimble as the Zero, but it had a toughness to it, a rugged durability that made the Japanese pilots wary. It didn't turn as sharply as the Zero, nor did it have the agility to rival the Japanese machine, but what it lacked in speed, it more than made up for in sheer endurance. As Miyamoto watched the Hellcats in formation, he realized that these were not the same disorganized pilots he had seen during the early days of the war. These were experienced flyers, and they were relentless. They didn't hesitate. The moment they spotted Miyamoto's squadron, they dove. Their Hellcats screamed through the sky, fast, deadly, and with a level of precision that made the Japanese pilots' stomachs turn. Miyamoto's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled the stick back, twisting his aircraft into a sharp turn to evade the first wave of American fighters. The dogfight that ensued was like nothing Miyamoto had experienced before. The Japanese pilots were accustomed to striking quickly, their Zeros darting in and out of the enemy formations with deadly accuracy. But the Hellcats didn't break. They didn't falter. They stayed together, covering each other, moving with a precision that spoke to their superior training and the powerful force behind them. In the distance, Miyamoto saw one of his comrades fall. A Hellcat had found its mark, and the once proud Japanese aircraft exploded in a fireball. The pilots who once dominated the skies now found themselves the prey, their once unshakable confidence shattered by the sheer force of the American onslaught. Miyamoto's focus shifted. He could no longer rely on the agility of his Zero alone. This was a new kind of warfare, one in which strength and coordination triumphed over agility. He dove and rolled, trying to break through the Hellcat's grasp, but the American pilots were everywhere. They were in the sky, at his six, above and below him, cutting him off at every turn. There was nowhere to escape. At that moment, Miyamoto realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. America's sky, America's war. And in that sky, there was no place for his kind anymore. It was this realization that struck fear into the hearts of many Japanese pilots as they continued to clash with American forces over the coming months. The Marianas and later the Philippines and Iwo Jima became the graveyard of so many veteran pilots. The Hellcats had not only surpassed the Japanese aircraft in capability, but had taken the very air that was once their domain. What was left for the Japanese to do? The war would continue for another year, but the writing was already on the wall. The power had shifted, and with each passing day it became clearer that no matter how hard they fought, the Japanese air forces were fighting against a machine they couldn't defeat, one that was fueled by industrial might and the endless resources of the United States. As the final chapter of the Pacific War unfolded, the American Hellcat stood as the unmistakable symbol of their victory, saturated in a fury of firepower, precision, and strength that no enemy could match. In the weeks that followed the brutal engagements over the Marianas, the skies above the Pacific would never be the same. Miyamoto's squadron, along with many others, was slowly being whittled down by the overwhelming force of American fighters. With every sortie, they were faced not only with the Hellcats, but with the looming realization that their own tactics, honed over years of brutal conflict, were no longer enough. In the quiet moments between missions, the Japanese pilots began to talk, though not about strategy or the glory of battle. They spoke of the Americans, of the Hellcats that dominated the skies, and of their own frustrations at being outmatched. The Zero had once been the epitome of a fighter, nimble and deadly, but now it felt outdated, a relic of a bygone era. The airmen who flew it, the men who had once been proud warriors, began to question their own place in this war. These Hellcats, they aren't like the British Spitfires or the Russians' Yaks, said Sergeant Takahashi, one of the newer members of Miyamoto's squadron. He had fought in China and later over the Philippines, but the Hellcats were different. There was an air of despair in his voice, one that was becoming more common among the pilots. They don't break. They just keep coming. We shoot one down and there's always another right behind it. Miyamoto sat in the cockpit, staring out over the dark waters below. The frustration in Takahashi's voice echoed his own. There had been a time, not long ago, when the Japanese were feared across the skies. They had struck with precision, and their Zeros were considered the epitome of aerial combat. But now, it was the Americans who were the ones to be feared. It was in the aftermath of one of their biggest engagements over the Marianas that Miyamoto found himself alone on a quiet beach, staring out into the ocean. His comrades had been lost, one by one, in the chaos of the skies. The Japanese pilots who remained were bruised, tired, and broken. In the distance, he could see the flashes of American bombardment on the horizon. The Allied forces were closing in, and Saipan, once a Japanese stronghold, was slipping through their fingers. The battle for the Marianas was quickly becoming a loss, not just in the air, but on the ground as well. It was here, in the silent aftermath of the aerial battles, that Miyamoto had his moment of clarity. The fight was no longer about planes, about machines, or about tactics. It was about something much deeper. It was about the soul of his nation, the belief that Japan's spirit could overcome any obstacle. But Miyamoto knew that belief was being tested like never before. The Hellcats were everywhere. They weren't just fighters. They were symbols of the unstoppable American war machine. To the Japanese pilots, it was no longer about beating the enemy. It was about survival. The Hellcats weren't going away.
They were going to keep coming, and as long as they flew, they would continue to dominate the skies. And so, as the battle for Saipan raged on, Miyamoto made a decision that would mark the end of an era for the Imperial Japanese Navy's air forces. He had fought valiantly for his country, but now the realization was clear. The war was lost, and there was no greater shame than to die knowing the enemy would never stop. The Japanese pilots, once revered as the apex of aerial combat, now found themselves fighting a war they could not win. The American Hellcats were not just machines, they were the embodiment of a nation's unwavering will to win, to adapt, and to overcome. Miyamoto and his comrades began to talk about escape. Many of the pilots, realizing that the war was slipping away, began to question their role in this conflict. The once proud aerial warriors found themselves exhausted, their spirits broken by the sheer scale of the American assault. The Hellcats were everywhere, in the air, on the ground, in the factories, in the training camps. It was impossible to avoid them. The sound of the Hellcats' engines was a constant reminder that America's sky had become its own, a sky filled with a new generation of fighters who had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. As the war continued into 1945, Miyamoto's squadron faced increasingly difficult odds. The Japanese air forces were stretched thin, their resources dwindling, and their morale shattered. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, they kept fighting, though their hearts were no longer in it. It wasn't until late in the war, when Japan's cities were being bombed into oblivion, that the final realization hit Miyamoto and his comrades. They had fought for a cause they believed in, but that cause had been swallowed up by the unstoppable force of American industrial might. The Hellcats, once just another weapon in America's arsenal, had become the harbingers of Japan's defeat. Every time they flew into the skies, they marked another nail in the coffin of Japan's once proud imperial ambitions. When the war finally ended, Miyamoto, like so many other pilots, was left to pick up the pieces. His once proud uniform was now tattered and worn. The sky that had once belonged to the Japanese Air Forces was now firmly in the hands of the Americans, and the Hellcats, the very planes that had turned the tide of the war in the Pacific, stood as a symbol of that loss. Years later, Miyamoto would look back on those days with a mixture of pride and regret. He had fought for his country, but in the end, it was America's war, the war they had won through sheer determination, innovation, and industrial power. The Hellcats were no longer just a fighter. They were a reminder of what had been lost and what could never be regained. America's sky, America's war. And in that sky, there was no place for the Japanese pilots who had once dominated it. The legacy of the Hellcats would live on long after the war had ended. In the years that followed, those who had fought in the Pacific would speak of the Hellcats with a quiet reverence, acknowledging the powerful force they represented. And though many of those who had faced them were gone, the stories of those encounters would continue to echo through history. The Hellcats had proven something that no one had expected, that in war, it wasn't always the fastest or the most agile that triumphed. Sometimes, it was the ones who could endure, who could withstand the pressure, and who could keep coming back. In the end, it was America's sky and America's war, and in that sky, there was no place for the Japanese pilots who had once dominated it. The months rolled on, and by early 1945, the skies over the Pacific had become a battlefield unlike anything seen before. The Hellcats, now the backbone of the American Air Forces, were everywhere. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, from the skies above the Philippines to the airspace over Japan itself, they were a constant presence, powerful, relentless, and unyielding. For the Japanese pilots, the end of the war was no longer a matter of if, but when. The fight for survival had become an exhausting ordeal, and the realization that their aircraft, their strategies, and even their belief in their own superiority were no match for the overwhelming might of America's military-industrial complex, began to settle in like a suffocating fog. It wasn't just the Hellcats that made the difference. It was everything. The Americans had learned from their losses, they had adapted, and they had brought their industrial power to bear in a way that left the Japanese in awe and despair. Factories churned out thousands of aircraft. Training camps produced pilots faster than they could be shot down. Every battle, every sortie, only showed the Japanese pilots how hopeless their situation had become. Miyamoto sat in his cockpit one morning, staring out at the vast blue of the Pacific below him. The sound of his Zero's engine was a faint hum compared to the deafening roar of the Hellcats that now filled the skies. It had been weeks since he had seen a single Japanese aircraft that had come back from battle intact. The losses were staggering. The realization was even more so. The once proud Imperial Navy, with its formidable air forces, was being broken piece by piece, and nothing they did seemed to change the outcome. But even as the situation became more dire, Miyamoto's squadron, like many others, refused to give in. It was more than duty now. It was pride. They had fought for Japan, for their families, for their way of life. Despite the odds, despite the overwhelming power of the American forces, they would continue to fight. It was a sentiment shared by many of the surviving pilots, who had already experienced the horrific loss of comrades and witnessed the destruction of their homeland. The war wasn't just a conflict anymore. It had become a brutal test of their spirit. But then came a day that would change everything for Miyamoto. A day that encapsulated the transformation from hope to hopelessness, from fighter to prey. The sky was thick with the roar of engines as his squadron went up to face the enemy once again. He could see the Hellcats above, flanking them from every direction. His eyes narrowed as he tried to focus on his target, but the American fighters were too fast. The battle began, a frantic rush of maneuvering, but something was different. The Hellcats were too organized, too precise. They were everywhere. A burst of gunfire from a Hellcat struck Miyamoto's wing. He yanked on the stick, pulling his Zero into a sharp dive, but the damage was done. His plane shuddered violently as another Hellcat appeared, locking onto him. The sky was full of them, and every move he seemed to make was anticipated by the Americans. He fought to control the aircraft, his breath coming in short bursts. His thoughts were muddled with desperation. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about whether he could make it through this fight, or whether he, like so many before him, would be swallowed by the overwhelming might of America's Air Force. As he fought to regain control, Miyamoto could feel the end drawing near. The Hellcats were relentless, hammering down on him with waves of fire, their guns spewing a stream of bullets that tore through his aircraft's fuselage. His heart pounded as he saw the bright tracer rounds streak past him. This wasn't like the dogfights he had experienced in the past, where skill and precision could tip the scales. This was a war of attrition. The Americans were in the sky, and they weren't going anywhere. The overwhelming weight of the situation hit him like a wave. The Hellcats weren't just unbeatable machines. They were the embodiment of America's overwhelming industrial power. For every pilot lost, for every plane shot down, there was another waiting in the wings, ready to take their place. Miyamoto's Zero, a machine that had once been a symbol of Japan's military might, now felt fragile in the face of the American onslaught. He could hear the crackle of his radio as his squadron leader's voice came through, a faint signal amid the chaos. "We're losing them! Fall back, Miyamoto! Fall back!" But it was too late. A final burst of gunfire hit his engine, and the world around him exploded in a shower of sparks. His vision blurred as his plane's systems failed. The sky around him spun wildly, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The next thing Miyamoto knew, he was tumbling toward the ocean, his parachute billowing behind him. His world had turned upside down, and the once bright blue sky now seemed a cold, unfeeling expanse. He was still alive, but he wasn't sure how much longer that would last. The sea stretched out below him, vast and indifferent. Miyamoto's mind raced as he descended. His thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and despair. He had always believed that Japan would triumph, that the strength of the Imperial Navy and its air forces would carry them to victory.
The years passed slowly after the war. For Miyamoto, the memories of the Hellcats, their shrill roars, their impenetrable formations, the relentless precision of their gunners never left him. He would often wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, hearing the echo of their engines in the stillness of the dark. In the quiet moments, when the world seemed at peace, the terror of those final engagements would surge back to him. He had survived the war, but the war was far from over for him. It had become an indelible part of his soul, a haunting that would never fade. Miyamoto often found himself sitting by the window, looking out at the ocean, the very same ocean that had swallowed so many of his comrades. He thought of the young pilots who had flown beside him, their bright eyes filled with hope, their spirits unwavering. They had all believed in victory. They had all believed that Japan's spirit would carry them to the end. But they hadn't accounted for America's will. America's war machine had been like a tide, unstoppable and relentless. The Hellcats were just one example of that might. The F-6F Hellcat, heavy, sturdy, and unyielding, had proven more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of everything the Japanese had miscalculated. The sheer scale of American production, the unwavering resolve, and the unrelenting ingenuity that powered every aspect of the war effort. In the prison camps, as the survivors of the war, both American and Japanese, exchanged stories and learned to understand the other's suffering, the pilots who had faced the Hellcats came to a grim realization. They had underestimated their enemy in every conceivable way. The Americans had taken the lesson of the war to heart, and they had adapted. While the Japanese had fought with all their honor, skill, and tradition, the Americans had fought with relentless innovation, mass production, and overwhelming numbers. Miyamoto found himself contemplating the aircrafts he had faced in the war. The Hellcat was one of many. There have been other American fighters that took to the skies, each with its own power, its own fury. But the Hellcat had become something else. It wasn't just another plane, it was the embodiment of American will. It was what made the Allies so formidable, a perfect combination of mass production, relentless firepower, and unyielding endurance. When they flew, it wasn't just about the dogfight, it was about overwhelming the enemy with sheer force, suffocating them with numbers and superior equipment. Every encounter had demonstrated how the Hellcat, through its durability, could absorb punishment that would destroy most other aircraft. The combination of heavy armor and the ability to maintain high-speed dives made it an aircraft that could simply outlast its foes. And when it did engage, the 8.5 caliber Browning machine guns mounted on the wings delivered a storm of bullets that no plane could withstand. To Miyamoto, that was the key. The Hellcat's ability to absorb damage and keep fighting. It wasn't perfect in every area. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most agile, but what it had was durability, and that durability meant survival. Survival, as it turned out, was America's ultimate advantage. In the years that followed, Miyamoto found solace in the quiet of civilian life. The world had moved on, and the memories of the war, though still sharp, began to blur as the years turned into decades. But whenever a veteran's story was told, whenever the echoes of past battles reverberated through the halls of history, the Hellcats would appear in his mind. It was a presence he could never escape. He recalled the Japanese pilots who had fought alongside him in the final months of the war. Many of them were lost, their planes torn apart by Hellcat fire. The young faces that had once been full of pride and excitement were now forever gone, their memories relegated to the annals of history. And then there was the memory of the last days of the war, the final moments when Miyamoto and his fellow pilots realized that Japan's defeat was no longer a possibility. The loss of Saipan, the fall of Iwo Jima, the relentless push across the Pacific by the American forces, all of it was a testament to the unshakable might of the United States. It wasn't just that they had lost the Pacific, they had lost to a force that could never be rivaled. The Hellcats, emblematic of that force, had come to define the final act of the war. They were the harbingers of destruction, the embodiment of everything Japan had failed to understand. When Miyamoto thought of the Hellcats, he thought not only of their physical presence in the air, but of the unyielding, unstoppable will that had driven America's war effort to its inevitable conclusion. The legacy of the Hellcats lived on long after the war had ended. In museums across the world, the planes were displayed as relics of a bygone era. They had flown with power and grace, becoming a symbol of America's victory. But to those who had fought against them, they were a constant reminder of how the tide of history had shifted. Miyamoto would often visit one of these museums. He stood before the glass case that housed a model of the Hellcat, its sleek lines and deadly profile staring back at him. The small plaque beneath it described the plane as a force to be reckoned with, a weapon that had been critical in securing American victory in the Pacific. To Miyamoto, it was more than just a plane. It was a symbol of his defeat, of the battle he had lost, of the unyielding strength of America's sky. He could see in every detail of the aircraft the raw power that had crushed the Japanese air forces, the aircraft that had forced him and his comrades into retreat. In the stillness of the museum, he closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the roar of those engines, the sight of Hellcats sweeping through the air. They weren't just planes anymore. They were memories, reminders of the war he had lived through and the war he had lost. Miyamoto's life after the war was marked by a strange mixture of reflection and reconciliation. The pain of loss never fully disappeared, but it gave way to a deeper understanding of the conflict. In his later years, he would often talk about the war, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson learned through hardship and loss. And the Hellcats, he would admit, were an integral part of that lesson. As he looked back on the war, Miyamoto recognized the one thing that had made America's war machine so terrifying: its ability to keep coming, to adapt, to outlast. While the Japanese had relied on precision, speed, and skill, the Americans had built their strength on something else: their endless capacity for reinvention and industrial power. The Hellcats were just one example of that. The legacy of the Hellcats wasn't just in the destruction they wrought, but in the lasting impact they had on the world. Their roar, once a sound of terror, had become a symbol of resilience and dominance in the sky. And for Miyamoto, they represented the final defeat, one he could never escape, but one that had shaped his understanding of the true nature of war. As the years passed, Miyamoto lived quietly, always carrying with him the memories of those days in the Pacific. He had seen his comrades fall, he had seen the world shift beneath his feet. And in those final days of the war, when the Hellcats filled the sky, he had witnessed the true power of the American military machine, something that could not be stopped, no matter how much courage was thrown against it. The final chapters of the Pacific War had been written by the Hellcats, and though they had been defeated in the skies, the lesson learned would never be forgotten. The Hellcats, unassuming in their design, yet unstoppable in their mission, had been the instruments of that final, crushing blow. And in Miyamoto's heart, as he reflected on those last battles, he understood that the sky above America's shores had been the final battlefield. America had won not by being faster, not by being more agile, but by being unstoppable. The Hellcats had shown the world what that meant: